Tafik, first of all, let me thank you and In Defense of Christians for the outstanding work that you are doing. You are truly making a difference, and I want to thank His Beatitude for the leadership that he has provided, and frankly, the clerics that are in this room for so bravely and steadfastly standing for the gospel, especially when there is such a huge price to be paid. I'll be brief tonight. I learned a lesson, and I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago at a talk. I was asked to speak at a Lyme disease gathering. It's about 1,000 people, lots of children, came with their parents to this conference, and they said, you're giving the keynote, and you got an hour. Well, I took an hour and 5 minutes. At the end of it, this little girl came up, about 4 years old, and said, "Mister, your speech was long and boring." And she turned around and walked away. A few minutes later, her father came up and said, "I know you're talking to my little daughter, Melissa. I just want you to know she's at that awkward age where she just repeats whatever she hears." So please endure 8 or 9 minutes of this member of Congress, and I'll be on my way. Let me just say at the outset, and I was talking to Pam Pryor about this earlier, she said, well, how did you get involved with religious freedom? It's simple. 37 years ago, during my first term in Congress, I read a book called Tortured for Christ by Romanian pastor Richard Wurmbrand. As so many of you know, it's a true story of unspeakable torture and psychological abuse of underground Christians under Romania's dictator Nicholas Ceausescu and Pastor Wurmbrand's 14-year incarceration. I was moved to tears when I read it, and I have reread it many times since. Like so many, both my wife, Marie, and I were inspired by Pastor Wurmbrand's indomitable faith, breathtaking courage, and then challenged by his admonishment to believers to cease enabling evil by our naivete, our cold-hearted indifference, our superficiality, or even cowardly complicity. His book was an engraved invitation to defend believers all over the world. Jesus' powerful and unambiguous teaching in Matthew 25, to see those construed by the world to be the least of these, to be as Christ himself, applies to so many in society, especially in the Middle East today. Paradoxically, the Christians suffering persecution, even martyrdom, like the Coptic saints, spiritual heroes on earth they are, and in heaven, but situationally, they are the least of these because of their circumstances. So whether it be defending unborn babies and their mothers from violence of abortion, or protecting vulnerable victims of human trafficking, or feeding the hungry, or mitigating disease, terrorism, and war, the exponential increase in the number of persecuted Christians worldwide begs a far more robust, effective, and sustained response. Thankfully, tonight, Vice President Mike Pence made very clear that this administration is all in, and they will provide the humanitarian and other assistance that is so vitally, has been so lacking over the last several years. I can't tell you how grateful I and so many members of Congress and so many others outside of Congress are In Defense of Christians for so tirelessly and effectively advocating for the protection and preservation of Christians and Christianity itself in the Middle East, where it all began. Just for the record, my first religious freedom trip was to Moscow in 1982, Leningrad and Moscow. We visited with Soviet Jews, Pentecostals, and Orthodox leaders and clergy. And I was so moved by how persecuted they were, but also how resilient and how the scriptures buoyed them to stand up against such oppression. It seemed to be overwhelming, and many times it was. I began to grasp Solzhenitsyn's observation that communism doesn't merely believe that God does not exist, it hates him. Solzhenitsyn called it militant atheism. On another trip to China, 1994, I met with Bishop Xu Jimin of the Roman Catholic Church, an underground church leader. He was rearrested soon thereafter, spent a total of 40 years in the Chinese Laogai, in the Chinese concentration camps. But amazingly, when he celebrated Mass for just a few of us that were in his dingy apartment, and it was small and unremarkable, I was touched by the absence of any malice whatsoever. And like Jesus Christ from the cross, was forgiving even those who had persecuted him and others in the church. Today, as perhaps never before, and unlike the communists who said God does not exist, there are some who seem intent on fulfilling Jesus' prophetic words in John 16:2, when he said, "The hour is coming when whoever kills you will think that he did a service to God." These killers that Jesus foreshadowed sound a lot like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, and Al-Shabaab. A few years ago, I was in an IDP camp in Nigeria, in Jos, Nigeria. I met a man named Habila Abdamu, dragged from his home by Boko Haram terrorists. He was ordered to renounce his faith. With an AK-47 pressed to his face, the terrorist said twice, "Will you give up your faith? And are you ready to die as a Christian?" And on both occasions he said yes. And the Boko Haram terrorist pulled the trigger and blew most of his faith off. By a miracle, he survived. When I met him, I asked him to come to Washington to tell his story before a congressional hearing. And he said, in part, "I am alive because God wants you to have this message. Knowing Christ is so much deeper than merely knowing Boko Haram's story of hate and intolerance." He closed his testimony and said, "Do everything you can to end this ruthless religious persecution, but know Christ first." And that's exactly what the Christians in the Middle East have been experiencing for many, many years, and it has gotten far worse in recent years. Right before last Christmas, some of my top staffers and I went to Erbil to meet Christian survivors of the ISIS genocide. It wasn't the first time that we made trips to the Middle East, but this one was at the request of Archbishop Warda. And we were there to press the United States government as well as the United Nations to help. Again, what Mike Pence, Vice President Pence, said tonight about making sure that our money goes directly to those who are suffering, and because it has not over the last several years. Shockingly, for several years, and we had 9 congressional hearings on my subcommittee trying to prod the administration to see what was right before their eyes, people who were starving, who needed medicine, food, and shelter. It was only through the generosity of Christian charities in Europe and the United States, including the United Knights of Columbus, led by my good friend Carl Anderson, and Aid to the Church in Need, and so many others, that these people were able to survive. We went to a camp with 6,000 internally displaced persons, many of them children and women, who had not even been visited by the United States government, even though it was about 10 minutes away by car from the consulate in Erbil. They told me I shouldn't go, nor should my staff. Too dangerous. And I said, "Is there a specific threat against my life?" And no. So I went with Archbishop Warda. He drove. We sat in the car. And when we got there, we heard stories that made us just feel such hope, but also to realize that we had had huge derelictions in our duty to protect and to help. We listened to hundreds of children singing Christmas carols to Jesus. It was right before Christmas, at the top of their lungs. It was just beautiful. We saw impoverished Christians who were rich in faith. We also heard Christians tell stories of the ISIS atrocities, the desecration of churches and booby-trapping of those churches, the murder of young men, and you all know this, many of you know it firsthand, and of course the sexual assault of so many women and young girls. And yet throughout it all, biggest takeaway, we heard people declare their love for God despite it all, of resilient Christians who are radiating Christ and hope, faith, and charity in those direst of circumstances. And we join the faithful in prayer for the persecuted as well as for those who persecute. That is why the House of Representatives passed the Iraq and Syria Genocide Emergency Relief and Accountability Act, H.R. 390, on June 6th, and why we are appealing to the Senate to pass it now. Don't wait any longer. Delay is denial, and I encourage you, as you're lobbying, to talk to the senators and get this legislation on the floor of the Senate and down to President Trump, who has already said he will sign it. Just so you know, H.R. 390 directs the U.S. government to provide immediate humanitarian and reintegration assistance to Christians and other religious minorities who survived the genocide. It ensures that funds reach the victims by authorizing assistance to ensure that entities helping them on the ground, like the Archdiocese of Erbil, get the funding. They have been bypassed. UNHCR didn't get it to them. We tried. It has to go directly to them, and that, again, is what Mike Pence spoke to this evening. It also has a very critical component to ensure that there is accountability. Joseph Reese, Ambassador Joseph Reese, who was my former chief of staff on the Human Rights Subcommittee, we worked very hard on these ad hoc tribunals, like the one in Rwanda, like the one in Sierra Leone and former Yugoslavia, that held people to account. And probably the best of all the hybrids courts was the one in Sierra Leone, where Charles Taylor, the former president of Liberia, got 50 years for his crimes against humanity. This legislation ensures that we collect actionable evidence. Some are already doing it. It needs to be done in an absolutely systematic way so that we can prosecute and hold those people to account who have committed these horrific atrocities. Finally, we're at a tipping point. Archbishop warned, and I quote him in closing, "What becomes of these remaining Christians will be decided based upon the actions the world will take now." And I say actions because there is no time left for words. Truly, these coming months may well decide the fate of Christianity in Iraq, and I would go say for other areas as well, whether it survives and is given a chance for rebirth, or whether it perishes, existing only as a few scattered museum pieces with caretaker clergy, of interest to tourists and academics, but without the Christian people who lived there for 2,000 years. Thank you for this award. I'm humbled by it, but it is a team effort, and we're all in this together. Thank you.